Are we heading for war and a recession? The world is at a tipping point. How vulnerable is Australia? Welcome to Q&A. Very warm welcome. I'm Stan Grant. We're coming to you live from Melbourne tonight. Joining me on the panel, Research Fellow at the Lowy Institute, Jennifer Sue, Minister for International Development and the Pacific, Pat Conroy, who's just returned from the Solomon Islands, Shadow Minister for Cybersecurity and Countering Foreign Interference, James Paterson, Australian Bureau Chief at the New York Times, Damien, and live from Brussels, Head of the International Trade and Union Confederation, Sharan Burrow. Please make them welcome. Now, as always, you can stream us on iView, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Quanda is the hashtag. Please get involved. Let's get to our first question, and it comes from Su Lin Ho.
Tensions are high with the Taiwan-China situation. Does the panel genuinely believe that China will escalate things? China may be forceful, but they don't do things rashly. So aren't they just flexing their muscles prior to their 20th Party Congress that will occur later this year? I ask this as someone who has lived and worked in the region.
Thanks, Sue Lin. Pat Conroy.
Oh, well, thanks, Stan, and thank you for the excellent question. I can't engage in hypotheticals about what will happen in the future, but what I can say is it's in the interest of everyone in the region for de-escalation to occur now. We need restraint, and we need to really focus on a peaceful and prosperous region where we respect and honour the status quo that is there at the moment. The Australian government's position is there should be no unilateral change to the status quo, and there's a bipartisan commitment to the One China policy.
Pat, just after the appearance of the Chinese ambassador at the National Press Club this week, where clearly there were red lines, we will not compromise over Taiwan, he said, all necessary measures will be taken, reiterating what we've heard from Xi Jinping about the potential use of force to, as the Communist Party sees it, reunify Taiwan with the mainland. I'm wondering how that changes Australia's relationship with China, given that there were signs potentially of a thaw. Does that now put things on the back foot again?
Well, I was concerned, like many people, by some of the language used by the ambassador yesterday. And we have been seeking to stabilise the relationship because that's in the interest of both China and Australia. But what is essential at the moment is that de-escalation occur, the heat comes out of the tensions that are there. But let me repeat again that the Australian government's policy is that there can be no unilateral change to the status quo. That's essential, and as I said, the language there was a bit concerning. We just have to move past it. Australia will always stick up for its values and interests, but where we can cooperate with China, we will. Where we disagree, we will do that as well.
James Paterson, Taiwan has always been a flashpoint. 1996, things got very close to a conflict, but now it seems to be ramped up even further. Why are we seeing this change?
Well, to come directly back to Su Lin's question, the late American poet Maya Angelou had a wonderful phrase that when people show you who they are, believe them the first time. And the Chinese Communist Party has not just shown us once who they are, they've shown us who they are in Tibet, they've shown us who they are in Xinjiang, they've shown us who they are in Hong Kong, they are showing us again who they are in Taiwan. And the ambassador at the press club yesterday showed us again who they are, and we should believe him. They are very serious when they say all options are on the table and that we should use our imagination to think about what they might do. And it doesn't require much imagination to think about what they might do. And we should believe them when they say that re-education of the 23 million free people of Taiwan is something that they have planned for after taking Taiwan. And we should treat that very seriously as Australia. I agree with everything that Pat said, and the opposition completely backs the government and the government's handling of this issue, and we completely back the 50-year bipartisan One China policy of Australia. But as a country, we need to be doing everything we can to contribute to our allies' collective efforts to discourage a unilateral and forceful change to the status quo.
Suelin, can I come back to you? Is that how you see things? Do you believe that what we are seeing with the increased war games over Taiwan and the increased rhetoric, the real face of the Communist Party of China?
I lived in Hong Kong, so I was sort of at the end of my time in Hong Kong, that was the rise of the umbrella revolution, right? It happened on my doorstep. But I don't know, it's really hard because I didn't think that was going to happen in Hong Kong, right?
The umbrella movement, or what came after the crackdown?
What has come.
Right.
But at the same time, you know, I'm of Chinese heritage, so we have this saying about saving face, right? And so I think what's happened in recent days, in a way, that is China, you know, it sort of responding to the US and Nancy Pelosi's visit, right? So I just don't think that they will be rash as to actually start war and an outright invasion of Taiwan. I just think that's going too far. And particularly with the current economic environment over there, right? It just doesn't make sense.
Jennifer, is that how you see it?
So I'd like us to think a little bit differently about the situation by placing Taiwan and its people, the Taiwanese, at the centre of the conversation, because I think a lot of the media coverage that we've seen over the last 2 weeks have really centred on US-China. There's an island of 23 million people whose voice we haven't heard. What do they want? How do they see their futures? And I think earlier this year, the Brookings Institution released survey findings to say 82% of Taiwanese want some form of status quo. That's a huge number. So, and a lot of Taiwanese commentators over the last 2 weeks have said, you know, people are getting on with their everyday lives in Taiwan. World War III is not imminent.
The status quo does not mean Taiwanese independence, because that's always been the line, hasn't it? That the status quo holds. Taiwan does not seek independence. The Communist Party, the PRC, does not seek to change that balance. That's what you're saying that the people would like to see remain.
Yeah, so I think Taiwanese, by and large, do not want to be in this military tensioned situation. They have a voice. They're a liberal democracy, it's vibrant, their civil society is active, and a lot of things have come to the fore because of that interaction between the democratic institutions and the civil society of Taiwan, irrespective of what China is doing. So I think those are the things that we ought to be focusing on.
It's interesting you mentioned status quo, though, and that's something that came up, too, because in the conversations that I've had with military experts and officials in various countries, one of the things that needs to be recognized is that China has changed the status quo by its response to Nancy Pelosi's visit. There were missiles that dropped in Japanese waters in their exclusive economic zone. Some of the missiles flew over Taiwan. They were in an area that they haven't been before. And so I think one of the concerns that a lot of people have is even if this doesn't go all the way toward invasion, it's moving the line. It's changing the status quo and creating a dynamic where it can be more militarized more often. And so the standard of what's acceptable Chinese behavior has now just moved.
Does that then bring the clock forward as well? Because China is increasing its military capacity, Damien. Does that then raise questions about countries like the United States, Australia will be brought into that as well, to be able to resist that or support Taiwan in the event that there is hostility?
Well, I think that's still the big unanswered question, right? Is this part of the conversation has been about China versus the U.S. because I don't think anyone anticipates that Taiwan on its own would be able to defend against China, especially with its military and how much strength it's gained in the past few years. But in some ways, it goes beyond that, too. It's also about the allies in the region. And I think in some ways, this was a test case, not just for Taiwan, China, the United States, or even Australia. It's a test case for the entire Asia-Pacific region. Where are people going to line up? Where are countries going to line up? And I think it's still really unsettled. And this happens a lot when there's great power competition, if you look through history, where these unsettled moments are often the most scary moments.
Sharan, from where you sit in Europe, what's the view from there? Of course, there's a war underway in Ukraine, but watching the events in Taiwan as well. And if I can get you to factor this in as well, when you talk about China, you're also talking about an indispensable nation when it comes to the global economy, the biggest engine of economic growth. So there is so much hinging on this. How do you see it?
Well, you're right, Stan. You have more than 20% of the world's population about a third of the world's workforce actually in China, and they are, for better or worse, part of the global economy. In a multipolar world where we're seeing fractures everywhere, there's a lot of posturing, but I want to return to, in fact, the point that if we don't put people, and I would add the environment, people and planet, at the heart of our strategic thinking, and base that strategic thinking on a commitment to telling the truth. I can't walk away from the fact that our unions have been dissolved in Hong Kong, that our leaders are in jail. Am I worried about Taiwan? Yes, we have members there. But we also know that unless there's a sense of a common security and it's backed out by critical, honest dialogue to try and find common ground, then we're just escalating with, indeed, the kind of language we saw yesterday from the ambassador. Although I want to make a point about that. I listened to it very carefully, and under the bellicose language, there actually was a commitment to dialogue with Australia, to re-engage, but also to a broader global environment around trade and settling trade disputes either through the WTO, that's a bit fractured right now as well, or bilaterally. So while we need to be very clear about our value set and about what human behaviour we can tolerate, and right now I'd just say the Uyghur people, forced labour, Hong Kong, at the same time, we would never argue that you don't engage with China because we have to find a common security for everybody, and it shouldn't be just about military security. That will not get us the distance we need to go.
Thank you for your question, Sue Lin. It's got a good conversation starter. Our next question comes from Li Shisu.
Good evening, panel. Why do we persist in labeling China as our major security threat when history strongly suggests otherwise? The evidence shows that it is the US and its allies that have waged unceasing and sometimes unjustified wars. Former US President Jimmy Carter declared the US is the most warlike nation in the history of the world due to a desire to impose American values on other countries. So, who is the real threat to our security?
Damien Cavers, as the American on the panel, I'll hand that one to you.
You know, it's interesting. I think lately I've been looking at a lot of history of previous periods of great power rise. And I think, you know, when you look at the way great powers project themselves onto the world, especially at a moment when that period of surge is happening, there's an assumption that they know what's best. And I think it's a very fair argument to say that at various points in America's rise, it was imposing its will or imposing its sense of righteousness on other parts of the world. I spent a lot of my career in Latin America. That's very much the perspective there. But I also think it's just as valid a question to ask whether or not China, as a new emerging power, thinks that it has all the answers and thinks that its system is best. In both cases, you have to watch out for hubris. And I think that wars often are created when countries are too convinced of their own rectitude, too convinced that they have all the answers, and think that they can impose their will on other countries and assume that the way they do things is the way that every country should do things. So to me, I don't think of it in terms of an individual country. I think it's important to think of the values and to make sure that the countries that, as they become more powerful, also maintain a degree of inclusion, of humility, of all the values that I think as humans we all want from the people that we live with and our neighbors. And so the question is, how do you get countries to behave in that kind of way? And I think to some degree geopolitics is all about that. How do you get countries to behave like good neighbors? And when you have a neighbor that's got a lot more power than another neighbor, it's a lot harder to do.
Shisu, can I come back to you just on that question? Because I want to go to James Paterson just on this question of what a global order looks like and what America's role is in that. But when you talk about the unceasing war, the unjustified war, what are you talking about?
I'm talking about what Jimmy Carter also said about America being at war almost perpetually. And the point is, some of the wars have been absolutely unjustified, and we do not know about it until it's leaked. Take the Vietnam War, for instance. It was not until General Ellsberg came up with the Pentagon Papers that we found out it was based on lies. And the Iraqi War, it was so obvious. We were dragged into a war based on lies, and we went along willingly. And what's happened with all these wars, it is to further the agenda of certain parties, really, if you think about that, right? And all of these wars really caused a lot of death, millions of death, destruction, and millions of refugees displaced. Why? Absolutely unnecessary.
James Paterson.
The reason why the Chinese Communist Party is labelled as the biggest national security threat to Australia is because they are. Right now today, we are under near constant attack in the cyber realm from the Chinese Communist Party, whether it's the government or our critical infrastructure. Over the last 5 years, we have suffered record levels of foreign interference and espionage, and the Chinese government is the primary culprit of that. Right now, the Chinese government is acquiring military capability at the fastest pace of any nation in the world since World War II, and I think the evidence shows they're not just doing that for the fun of it. They have reclaimed islands in the South China Sea illegally, although Xi Jinping promised that he wouldn't. They have just fired ballistic missiles over Taiwan into Japan's exclusive economic zone. If we are not going to take this threat very seriously, we're going to regret it.
Pat Conroy, with all of the speculation about what may turn out to be the case in Taiwan, if there was actually a conflict in the worst possible scenario, where would that leave the United States and where would that leave Australia? If we talk about Australia following America into conflict, is that the sort of conflict that we would find ourselves in?
Oh, look, Stan, I don't think it's productive for me to engage in hypotheticals as a minister of the Australian government.
But Xi Jinping is not talking about a hypothetical. He's saying he would use force and reserves the right to use force to reunify Taiwan. That may be something that you confront much more sooner than we expect.
The Australian government's position is we support no unilateral change to the status quo. And if I can return to the gentleman's question, I'd make two quick points. One, I've just come back from the Solomon Islands where we're commemorating the 80th anniversary of the Guadalcanal campaign. That was the turning point critical to victory in the Pacific, where America, New Zealand, Australia, Solomon Islanders themselves fought for democracy and the preservation of peace. So I think we should be very clear about the contribution of America over the last couple of centuries, and it is the staunchest and strongest ally Australia has. But as a middle power, it's in Australia's interest to pursue a rules-based order where every nation absorbs and follows international laws and norms rather than pursuing a might is right agenda. And to James's point, illegal island building in the East and South China Seas challenges that rules-based order, and that's why it's so important for Australia and other countries to pursue freedom of navigation exercises. So I think it's in Australia's interest to have a rules-based order, and that's the core part of the Australian government's approach to foreign policy.
Can I just put a question to both James and Pat on this? James, you first. Was Nancy Pelosi wrong to go to Taiwan? Was that a provocative, unnecessarily provocative move?
To Jennifer's point earlier, I'm really conscious not to put Australia in the driver's seat and say that it is up to us to decide whether the Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States should visit Taiwan. The Taiwanese government invited Nancy Pelosi to visit and she accepted that invitation. And it is utterly routine for congressional delegations of the US to visit Taiwan. It's also routine for parliamentary delegations from Australia to visit Taiwan. I've been on one myself. Anthony Albanese himself went on one a few years ago. And we should support that because we maintain, consistent with our One China policy, extensive unofficial relations with the people of Taiwan, and we do that because we have common interests and common values with the people of Taiwan. Jennifer made the good point that the 23 million people of Taiwan have fought very hard for the liberal democracy that they have. And while Taiwan might be historically important to China and it might be strategically important to China, for the people of Taiwan it's their home. And I think they have to be at the heart of that conversation and at the heart of the resolution of this issue.
Pat Conroy, we're not just talking about a congressional visit though, we're talking about the Speaker of the House. This is second to the President of the United States in the political hierarchy of the US. Was it unnecessarily provocative given what we've seen since?
Oh, look, the question of US visits to Taiwan is a question for the United States, to be quite frank. I don't think it's helpful for me to speculate about that. I think James is right that there's been a number of unofficial visits by Australian parliamentarians, but that's entirely consistent with a One China policy, and I think it's really important to note that we can maintain good relationships with the Chinese government as well as having unofficial visits to Taiwan. The key thing now is the heat to come out, to de-escalate, and for everyone to show restraint.
Let's get to our next question. It comes from Lindy Priest.
Does Taiwan really belong to China, or does its history tell us differently, including the history of the indigenous people of Taiwan? Taiwan is closer geographically to Australia than Japan, but the world is being bullied by China to see Taiwan through CCP eyes?
Jennifer.
Well, I think there will be different historical interpretations here. China would say that Taiwan is an integral part of China. The Qing dynasty in the 16th, 17th century had claimed Taiwan or had ruled administratively over Taiwan, and then it gave it up after the Sino-Japanese War when China lost in 1895. So the history is open to interpretation, but I would say in relation to the indigenous identity that is really important to Taiwan's identity is that over the last 30 years of China's democratization, we've seen a number of minority groups really fight for their for equity and for justice, including Indigenous voices and LGBTQ communities. And I think that fight is reflected in some of the experiences that we see here in Australia happening today. And so I would say there are some parallels between the Taiwanese situation and the Australian situation, and it is about, rights, equity and justice.
There is this phrase, reunification, that Xi Jinping talks about. And when you were going through the history there, Jennifer, just explain to us what the claim the Chinese Communist Party has on Taiwan, because since 1949, what claim has the PRC been able to exercise on Taiwan, given the way that the Republic of China came about? So
during the Civil War in China, the communists won, the nationalists retreated to Taiwan, and the nationalists set up a government in Taipei and set up the Republic of China. So up until 1972, Australia had relationship with Taipei. Since 1972, Australia has recognised Beijing. So I think in terms of the history, Taiwan has, in its constitution drafted by the nationalists, says, Hong Kong, Tibet, and other territories are part of the Republic of China.
But Pat Conroy, a lot has changed since 1972, and Taiwan is a thriving democracy and economy. Why does it explain to people under the One China policy why Australia acknowledges the PRC's claim to Taiwan?
Well, I think the critical point there is that One China policy means that we recognise that there is one nation state of China. But I want to pick up Jennifer's earlier point about thinking about the people of Taiwan. Australian governments of all persuasions have said that there should be no unilateral change to the status quo is about the Taiwanese people. They need to consent to any change. Any change needs to be completely bilateral rather than unilateral. So I think that the One China policy is something that's been pursued for decades.
But China, sorry if we just come in there, we heard this from the ambassador this week, and China will often say, but under the One China policy, Australia says that Taiwan is a province of the PRC, that it acknowledges that. That's the question today. Why is there that acknowledgement given the situation that we have today?
Well, I disagree with the ambassador's assertion that we recognise it as a province per se. What we say is that there is one nation state of China, one sovereign government of the Chinese state that we recognise.
Which is the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party.
Absolutely. But we also recognise where the status quo is, and we think that there should be no change to it unless the people of Taiwan are involved in that process and consent.
James Paterson, that's what we broadly describe as this strategic ambiguity, that you can walk both sides of the street, if you like, that there can be a recognition of a one China, there is the People's Republic of China, but underneath diplomatic relations, there are a whole raft of relations that we have with Taiwan. Are we reaching the limits of that strategic ambiguity given the change that Damien spoke about before that we may be seeing to the status quo?
Yeah, look, headline up front, I'm not going to advocate on Q&A a change to our 50-year bipartisan One China policy. And the point that Pat makes, the really important distinction he draws is right. The Australian government's One China policy is not the same as the
One China principle.
One China principle. Yeah. We merely acknowledge the claim that they make to Taiwan. We don't recognise it. And that is a subtle but very important distinction that the Chinese government has often sought to muddy, often sought to confuse, often sought to imply that our policy commitment goes much further than it does. But on the history of strategic ambiguity, in Australia since 1972 and in the United States since 1979 with the passing of the Taiwan Relations Act in Congress, the liberal democracies in the region have supported this policy as a means of preserving the status quo. That's its purpose, because we all recognise that a change to the status quo, particularly a unilateral one and particularly one that was done by force, would be catastrophic for the people of Taiwan and for the region and for all of our interests. And so if it's been designed to discourage the people of Taiwan from a premature declaration of independence, which would probably invite a response, and it is also designed to discourage the Chinese government from initiating a change in the status quo. I have to say my observation of the last few weeks is the much greater risk of a change in the status quo is coming from the Chinese government, not the Taiwanese people. There are no moves to declare in the short or medium term independence of Taiwan, but China is showing very serious and very serious intent and very serious aggression towards Taiwan.
Sharan, Burrow, we were talking before about a global rules-based order, and that's what you work in from where you are in Brussels. And China is part of that order, isn't it? It's a member of the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, a permanent 5-member of the UN Security Council. We could go on and on. How does that order hold, though, and how does that resolve the sort of tensions that we're seeing over Taiwan right now?
Well, I think we're all committed to a rules-based order. Is that fractured right now? Yes. I'm sitting here thinking, though, Stan, that, you know, if you live in Europe like I do at the moment, then you have the European Union, but in those 27 countries, you have very, very broad scope of tensions around human rights, around economic resistance to some measures. OK, it's not at the risk yet of internal, you know, military posturing, but I think that, again, it's simply the point is you have to engage, and it has to be with people and common security. And I'm not just talking about military security. I'm talking about people having jobs, having wages on which they can live, having social protection, the things, the social contract that gives people confidence to feel that they're safe. And I do think that once we get beyond the Party Congress in China, there will be a whole range of discussions. There must be. But don't forget, we've also got the G20 coming up, and China and Russia, at this point at least, are sitting at the table. So, again, an opportunity. And while, you know, I'm not in Australia and I don't comment on Australian policy matters, I must say I've longed for an Australia that was what it used to be, a middle power that could bring some sense and, you know, I guess kind of quality dialogue to find common ground. And I think we have that back, and that certainly excites me. But the G20 will be a test about that.
Are you optimistic, Damien, that these institutions and these entities, organisations like G20 and others create an opportunity for the type of dialogue that may be necessary to bring down the tension that Pat and James have talked about?
I mean, it's clear that they represent an opportunity, but I'm not sure that any of these institutions are sort of up to the task at the moment. I think a lot of people feel like the sort of international order that was set up after World War II is probably in need of some updating. And I think in many ways, China is testing that system. Does that
updating need to reflect China's status in the world as a big power, soon to be potentially the biggest economy in the world, the biggest engine of economic growth in the world?
Well, I mean,
and how do you do that when it's an authoritarian regime? That's the dilemma.
I think it's more that the institutions need to figure out a way to be more efficient. And, you know, I think globally there's a frustration with the way the democratic institutions around the world work that China's been able to take advantage of. And I think the Western world, the democratic world, the free world, so to speak, needs to figure out a way how to do better and how to work together on big problems like climate change, like labor, like inequality, need to find ways to show that democracy is a better option. And, you know, I think things like the G20 are opportunities for actually the countries that are like-minded to try and really bolster that idea. At this point, I don't think there's nearly enough of that, and I think that's what you're seeing around the world is a deep frustration with the way that democratic institutions work or don't work as well as they could or should.
Let's get to our next question. It comes from Jun Gao. Jun?
As a Chinese Australian myself, I have felt the effects of the tumultuous COVID-19 pandemic, and now rising tensions within the South China Sea. What can be done to destigmatize the Chinese Australian population?
Jennifer, the Lowy Institute's done some work around this, hasn't it? Tell us what it found.
So the Lowy Institute over the last 2 years have surveyed Chinese Australians and their sentiments on living in Australia, sense of belonging, a range of geopolitical issues, and also the state of bilateral relations. And we find in this year's survey that generally Chinese Australians feel a sense of belonging, although that has decreased since 2020, a general sense of belonging, pride in Australian life and culture. And I think these are all positive indicators of Chinese Australians' contribution and integration into Australian society. But yes, I would agree with you that over the last 2 years, due to COVID and pandemic lockdown, the sense of fragmentation has happened, in part due to discrimination, racism, when you've got former presidents or leaders of the world saying it's a China virus, so really stigmatizing and giving it a geographic indicator. I think that doesn't help. It doesn't help Chinese Australians or Chinese Australian communities here. But I would say, there is potential positive points to look forward to. With the new government in power, there is signs of de-thawing between Australia and China relations. Obviously, that is all still very much on tenterhooks.
Jun, can I come back to you, just ask you, how have you experienced that? Have you personally experienced that, your family, the stigmatisation you've spoken about?
In general, I feel there's just a negative perception both in the schoolyard and in the media. And I fear that China's recent political actions will only compound this.
Because you mentioned COVID, and now, of course, we're seeing the tensions over Taiwan. Is that changing things? You say that could make it worse. Have you experienced that, seen that at all yet play out?
I do believe that it can make it worse, and I've seen certain circumstances which do show this. Yeah.
Well, Jennifer, when you look at that, what are the sort of things that people are telling you about that they have experienced? And I don't know whether you've experienced yourself personally either.
Well, I think the last 2 years have been terribly difficult. Yesterday at the Lowy Institute, we had a Migration Nation event talking about how multiculturalism can inform foreign policy making here in Australia. And I think one of the things that is missing in Australian society is that we haven't moved beyond celebrating the demographic reality that is Australia. The census over the last 5 or 10 years showed that Australia is becoming more multicultural, but we haven't moved beyond sort of that cultural aspect. What about integrating and institutionalising the voices of multicultural communities into policy making?
James Paterson, we've had instances where Chinese people have had their loyalty questioned or asked to almost pass a loyalty test when appearing at parliamentary committees. How do we differentiate between the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese people who are in China, and Chinese people in Australia?
Yeah, John, thank you for raising this issue. You're absolutely right too, and I've been concerned about this for some time. One of the first public interviews I gave after I became the Intelligence Committee Chair, I said that it is both morally wrong and counterproductive for Chinese Australians to be held culpable for the actions of the Chinese government. It's also wrong to hold the Chinese people culpable for the actions of the Chinese government because they had no say in picking that government. There was no vote which brought the Chinese Communist Party to power. It's morally wrong because it's not your fault, and it's counterproductive because we want Chinese Australians to feel just as much a part of the Australian community as everyone else and to be able to fully participate in that community. And I will always defend the right of Chinese Australians or any other Australian to have freedom of speech and to participate in public debates. Whether you share my views on the geopolitical situation or whether you completely disagree with me, you have every right to be outspoken about those issues. And to stand your point, we have to be very careful about our language. We have to be very clear that we are saying that our dispute and our disagreement is with the Chinese Communist Party or the government of China. It is not with the Chinese people, and we have to re-emphasise that at every opportunity because the Chinese people are rightly very proud of the achievements of their civilisation. It's an amazing culture. There's been 200 years of migration of Chinese people to Australia, and they've massively enriched our country. And so we, as political leaders, have a special responsibility to bear to make sure that Chinese Australians can participate fully in public and political and social life.
But I was just going to say, I mean, the thing I think this is what you were raising too, is that the institutions of government and the institutions of Australia need to better reflect that diversity. I mean, even something as simple as language schools and language training, it's simply not as common to be learning other languages in Australia as in a lot of other countries. There are so many things that can be done at a very basic level for Australia to actually embrace its multiculturalism and frankly embrace the world in a way that it is yet to fully do.
俊，谢谢。我会说一点普通话，谢谢。Our next question comes from Chantel O'Riordan.
With China's economy facing challenges and in light of the current escalating tensions in Taiwan, should Australia refocus its relations to members of the Quad, namely India and Japan? Should we adopt a renewed approach and reprioritise our Asian partners?
Pat Conroy.
Thank you for the question, Chantel. We should absolutely re-engage with Southeast and North Asia, and that can't just be on economics, although diversifying our economy, not putting all our eggs in a China basket is vital. But that's why we've engaged in a Southeast Asian diplomatic strategy that we announced before the last election that included greater diplomatic presence in the region, an additional almost $500 million in overseas development assistance.
You were just in the Solomon Islands. You made another commitment to support the Pacific Games. Australia's going to be a contributor to that. Are you starting? What sort of change were you seeing just in the most recent visit?
Well, I think there's a focus there on development. This is a country in a region where 1/3 of Pacific Islanders live on US $1.90 a day. Just think about that for a second if you can. Living on less than $2 American a day, which is the UN definition of absolute poverty. So the focus in the Solomon Islands, like many other parts of the Pacific, is economic development. How do they get out of the situation they face? How do they give their kids an education and start in life? So that's one focus for the Pacific. The other one is how do they deal with the existential threat that is climate change? When you're losing islands to climate change, this is your number one focus. So when I was there, my job was to be part of a really concerted Australian government re-engagement with the region to demonstrate that we're having more energy. Mine was the third visit to the Pacific since we were elected in late May. The Foreign Minister's been there 4 times, the Prime Minister's visited, and our 2 messages are we're re-engaging and, importantly, we're listening to your priorities. We're listening and acting.
Is there still a sense of catch-up here, lost ground? And the fact is that China is there. China is building infrastructure. It's increasing its investment, its aid. It's funding the stadium for the Pacific Games. Are we trying to catch up?
We are catching up from, to be quite frank,
and lost ground.
Yeah, there's been lost ground, and we're catching up for 9 years of neglect under the last government. And one of the key sticking points there was obviously the last government's refusal, A, to take action on climate change, and secondly, to actively block multilateral forums like the Pacific Islands Forum from taking action on climate change. So that's been a key stumbling block. But we've got huge opportunities to really rebuild the relationships. I visited an Australian Pacific Training Coalition centre where they're training workers to work in our meatworks in this country. And I met 2 returning meat workers, Joseph and Jared, and they'd come back from 3 years in Australia in Queensland. And they were earning, they were sending $6,000 or $7,000 back each year working in our country compared to families living on $2 a day. And they were starting businesses in their hometowns as a result of that, and they're going to come back to Australia. So we've got 25,000 Pacific Islander workers living in this country right now, sending back on average $6,000 US a year, which is sustaining those economies and giving those families a great hope. And I visited a school where we're rebuilding it post the riots late last year, and I met a Year 12 student called Joanna who was working on computers that we just provided, and she wants to be a lawyer. And that was so inspiring to hear her story about how she's clearly going to be a future leader in the Solomon Islands, and that's because of strong partnerships with countries like Australia and New Zealand to rebuild our presence in that region.
Can I bring Sharan Burrow in? Because one of the things that we've seen with China's increasing presence in the world, we're seeing with things like the Belt and Road Initiative, a new Silk Road for the 21st century, is that China can offer these types of incentives. China can develop countries, can go in and invest, create business opportunities. How tempting is that to the countries that you visit, and what impact is that having?
Of course it's tempting, particularly when Australia trashed its relationship in the last decade with the Pacific. When I was still working in Australia as the president of the ACTU, we engaged in discussions about mobility, about common economic zones. There was an optimism. Australia and New Zealand jointly took responsibility for development. You haven't seen that in almost a decade. Now, we need to do better. And I must say, Pat, thank you. Thank you to the government, because you're right. The 2 or 3 big issues, I should say. One is absolute poverty. The other one is, in fact, the risk of losing your home and your livelihoods from climate. But the third, whatever the combination of that is the desperation of sheer unemployment. Now, we can help. And China notwithstanding, what's wrong with actually sitting down and looking at where China can help? It doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. Now, I'm as hard-hearted, Stan, as anyone about China's behaviour in Hong Kong, with the Uyghur people. But I also know that while sanctions and isolation are tools, they're leverage tools. They draw a line around decent human behaviour, and they should. But in the end, you're only going to resolve conflict, and you're only going to give the people that we care about in the Pacific, particularly in this instance, or in other countries, a sense of security if we're not actually picking fights which have got nothing to do with them. I wanted to just say, too, I listened to the question about engagement with India, and, of course, absolutely the same thing. And if it points to, indeed, sensible de-escalation of dependency. And if you've learned anything in Europe, look at food and energy dependency for European countries on Russia and Ukraine, but certainly even around the world and the current inflationary spikes we see. But if we've learned anything from all of that, it's that we can't be dependent on any one nation. But don't look at India with rose-coloured glasses either. Well, their abuse of human rights in India is rising.
I want to come to James Paterson just on that. I'll give you a chance first, James, to respond to the criticism of your party's record while you're in government, and then I want to go to India.
Stan, I wouldn't say that our government got everything right in the Pacific, and I understand why the Labor Party and the union movement wanted to, before the election, criticise our record there. But now that the election's over, I don't actually think it's in Australia's national interest to pretend like nothing happened in 9 years and to talk down the very meaningful things we did with the Pacific in that period of time. I think the Pacific Step Up was a really far-sighted initiative 5 years ago under the Morrison government. We've invested incredibly in the Pacific, really refocused our international aid program to the Pacific, such that in the last budget, a record $1.7 billion of overseas development assistance was going there. And if you include other loans and grants, it was $2.7 billion investment. We are the security partner of choice for the Pacific. We were the supplier of vaccines, partner of choice for the Pacific. We helped vaccinate these countries to ways in which they could never have been able to do on their own. And that's an Australian achievement. And I don't claim that just for our government, but I don't think we should talk it down.
Can I just ask you quickly about, Sharan Burrow raised the question of India and more broadly alliances. India, as we know, does not have, under Narendra Modi, the greatest human rights record. He's been accused of trashing his own democracy, the treatment of Muslims in Kashmir, the citizenship tests that have been applied unfairly to different groups inside the country. Does it make for some awkward bedfellows when you champion India as a champion of democracy and in the Quad to push back against China? Is this the reality of pushing back against China? You have to deal with these realities.
India's not a perfect country and the Modi government is not a perfect government, but I think it's a really false moral equivalence to try and compare them to the Chinese government. It is a democracy. It has had many successful transitions of peaceful power from one party to another, and there are mechanisms through which they can examine and debate and resolve those internal issues that they have. That has not happened in China since the revolution, and there's no possibility it will happen in the future. And I don't think anything can compare to the systematic abuse of human rights that's happening in Xinjiang against the Uyghur people and other Turkic Muslims, where people like Human Rights Watch have called a crime against humanity. Other human rights bodies have said possibly a genocide. So this false moral equivalence which is sometimes drawn between India and China, I think, is actually shameful and dangerous.
Let's get to our next question. It comes from Nikki Chotala.
Good evening. Is capitalism actually destroying democracy?
Wow. Okay, Jennifer.
That's a very philosophical.
I know, it's always the simple questions that open up the biggest conversation.
But I think I would say, you know, capitalism takes on many different forms, and the way the capitalist system has evolved over the last many centuries, where we are now, you know, our workers, the people who work in different sectors, why is it that our educators, those who work in nursing homes, are paid the least when they are looking after the most vulnerable, or our children, who are our future? So I think there's some perverse effects in capitalism, but I think Sharan Burrow will probably have a more articulate answer.
I will come to Sharan in just a minute, but Damien, you just came back from the United States, and there we are seeing all of this playing out, aren't we? That you know, you see the rampant capitalism, it's the home of democracy, but we saw the protesters trashing the Capitol building. There is all the institutional rot that you talked about before, and the tensions within the country. What does it say about the capacity for democracy to endure and capitalism to deliver?
You know, I think capitalism is probably too broad a category, but one of the things that I did see in the United States that I think is not just apparent there, it's a growing problem in Australia too, is the power of inequality. The power of economic inequality to separate and create cleavages in society that are not healthy for democracy. And so in the United States, you have people who are not only divided by political party, they're increasingly divided by class, by belief, by style. One Republican Party will wear Wranglers, Democrats will wear Levi's. I mean, the cleavages are so deep, and yet we know statistically, and there's studies that have just come out recently showing that one of the keys to upward mobility is that you put people of different classes together. In the United States for a long time, in a lot of democracies, that was just a given. That's how it was. But unfortunately, late-stage capitalism, without guardrails and enough of a fight against inequality, creates systems where people just divide. And I think America's suffering those divisions right now.
And Sharan, how much of a threat to democracy globally is inequality?
Oh, well, let me start with the model of economy. The global model of economy has failed working people. There's no doubt about that. Even in the region we live in, or our country lives in, I don't at the moment, then 94% of the workforce in the global supply chains are a hidden workforce. And it's been based on a model where, in fact, you exploited labour in order to make maximum profits. And we've seen the growth of billionaires that is just incomprehensible. But when you look at why that is, Stan, a couple of things. Since the 1980s, the social contract's been broken. We've quadrupled our wealth, but we've seen labour income share go down like a Big Dipper and a roller coaster, and people are in despair. You heard Jennifer talk about why we don't distribute our wealth better, pay the people we depend on. COVID showed us that. It was, of course, those in healthcare, in childcare, in education, in transport, logistics, retail. They're amongst the lowest paid, and the majority are women. And that is about inequality. But we also need governments to step up and look at their responsibility for a rules-based order, nationally and internationally, where we again regulate. We regulate labour markets, we regulate competition. If you look at the inflationary spikes right now in food, then you have about 4 companies globally controlling food production and distribution, despite all the millions of poor farmers. And the Cargill family, for example, 70% of control of that food, 12 new billionaires, and a profit last year that was the largest in its 156-year history, and in fact more will be this year, and they're not alone. I just picked them out because if you look at the 9 new billionaires from the pharmaceutical companies in the US alone during COVID, and in fact when America invested a lot of its own capital, as did other taxpayers' money, as did other countries, but didn't hold any IP, so we could get rid of the insidious vaccine nationalism. You know, we've got things out of whack, Stan, and I think unless people are prepared, and indeed Damien said it, look at reform of the multilateral system, but also come back and regulate the labour market. Our labour market is broken. 60% of the world's people work informally, no rights, no minimum wage, no rule of law, and that's not just in developing countries. So we can do better, we must do better, and it is about full employment, It's about wages that people can live on with dignity. It's about shared prosperity and universal social protection. And I was struck by the Chinese students' question because it's also about inclusion and equality, both gender and race. If we don't want to shape the world that we believe rests on our common values, then we will see more of the same.
There's a lot in that. There is a lot in that, Pat Conroy, and coming into government during the campaign, of course, Anthony Albanese had talked about delivering for wage earners. But now, of course, he has to face the reality, as he's already said, that wage growth may not keep up with inflation. We are already starting to see the types of inequality that Sharan Burrow talked about. There was a study from University of New South Wales that caught my eye. 130 billionaires in Australia hold as much wealth as the 3 million people in the lowest 30%. How do you deliver for those people that you promised to deliver for?
Well, we're delivering right now through a minimum wage increase, for example, which I'll talk about in a minute. But back to the original
question. That's still not going to keep pace,
I don't think capitalism will destroy democracy, but inequality has that great potential. If people don't feel like they're invested in a system, why would they care about its existence? And that's what extreme inequality has a potential to do. And obviously this was a huge issue during the election campaign, and I remember many commentators and political opponents losing it when Anthony Albanese suggested a $1 an hour increase in the minimum wage.
But now he's admitting,
which we have delivered,
now he is admitting that wage rises can't keep up with inflation. That's likely to be the reality. You're going to have this jobs and skills summit. What are you looking to come out of that? Is that the sort of accord that we saw maybe during the Hawke-Keating years? How do you deliver on those things?
Well, what we're looking for is any constructive suggestions to improve our economic performance. You're absolutely right. We've got a couple of tough years ahead of us in terms of high inflation. Inflation that's been caused mainly by supply chain issues, particularly overseas, and that's why it's so important to diversify our economy and make us a bit more nationally independent from global supply chains so we can withstand those shocks. But the summit is all about how do we grow skills and productivity in this economy. Productivity has been sluggish for too long, and productivity in the long term is really how we get economic growth, which means jobs and higher wages. But inequality is something we have to tackle as well. When the people who literally risked their lives during the COVID pandemic, the nurses, the cleaners, the school teachers, when their pay doesn't rise, we have a huge issue. It was okay for me to work from home as a politician, but nurses couldn't, cleaners couldn't, bus drivers couldn't, and yet unless we make sure they're rewarded for their hard effort, that has major implications for our society.
Let's get to our next question. It comes from Ian Abbey.
I have a question for Senator James Paterson. In April 2022, Peter Dutton advised Australia that we should be prepared for war. If that is the case, why does Australia still export billions of tonnes of iron ore and coal to China? Should such exports be banned?
Well, the second part of that question may apply to Pat Conroy now that he's in government. But that first part of the question, James Paterson, thank you for that question as well, Ian. Was it wrong to talk about preparing for war? Does that contribute to the sort of talk that can lead ultimately to that type of scenario?
I wish there was no prospect of war. I wish it was completely remote, but we were being dishonest with the Australian people if we told them that that was the case. And Ukraine is a very powerful reminder that we are not past history. This is not some historical thing that happened that we study in the classroom. It's the reality right now today in Europe, where we're seeing the largest ground war since World War II, where tens, potentially hundreds of thousands of lives will be lost before it's over. And so regrettably, that means we do have to prepare because there are rising authoritarian...
What does that preparation mean? We've seen that the subs deal, then subs deal axed, and then a new deal under AUKUS to get nuclear-powered submarines. We know we're not at a point, the government's call for review into defence spending, we're not at a point where we've yet developed the sovereign defence capacity to meet potentially the war that Peter Dutton was warning about.
We have more work to do, but we're in a much stronger position than we were 9 years ago.
Did we lose ground over that 9 years?
No, I think we gained ground. I mean, when we took government, defence spending had been reduced to the lowest level since World War II, just 1.56% of GDP. It's now been restored to well north of 2%, and the Labor Party in government is now saying they're going to continue that, and we are rock solid behind them in supporting them to do that. And I think it's absolutely appropriate that Richard Marles, as Defence Minister, wants to have a review of our priorities. I hope that it's a review which recommends accelerating the things that we already put in place to acquire the capability we need to make a potential adversary, particularly a much larger one, think twice about threatening Australia or our interests or our values. And that's going to mean investment in asymmetric capabilities, as we have seen the Ukrainians very successfully use against a much larger adversary in Russia.
I want to bring the second part of the question that Ian raised, and I'll put it to you, Pat Conroy, and it is this question about if we are preparing for conflict, if relations are deteriorating, why are we still exporting billions of tonnes of iron ore and coal to China? I know there's an economic argument to be made there, but is that something that may be at risk?
Well, Stan, I want to address the first part of the question, which is in 2020, the Defence Strategic Update commissioned by the last government said that the basis for our entire defence policy over the last 50 years had disappeared, which is that we would get a 10-year warning cycle before a conflict. We would have 10 years warning before a potential war. That has disappeared. My problem with the last government is they did nothing about it.
I think we can spend all night going back. But
I actually think, Stan, it's an important point to make.
Quickly, though,
that we have
the clock's ticking.
We have 30 major defence projects we've inherited that are cumulatively running over 80 years late. We have 2 cancelled submarine, a cancelled project with the French that delivered 0 submarines for $3.5 billion. We've got frigates that are running 2.5 years late. We had defence ministers under the last coalition government that lasted shorter times than goldfish. We had 6 defence ministers in 8 years, and that led to huge instability and a lack of acquiring the weapons that the last government strategic update said we needed. So the new government is really focused on changing that.
It's not answering.
On your second question, look, warning cycles have been reduced, but that doesn't mean that we have to be silly about this, because no one is talking about who a potential adversary is. We're merely saying that we're in a region with increased militarisation, increased investment in military capabilities by many actors, so we can no longer rely on a 10-year cycle. What this government is pursuing is strong economic strategy as well as strong national security, and that means we should export where we can.
Our final question of the night comes from Jacqueline Plunkett.
Hi. If each member of the panel had $100 million to spend on the defence budget, how would each panel member apportion that budget towards cyber intelligence or equipment or personnel? And do you think the current mix is appropriate or realistic for the future?
Jacqueline, I'm not sure we'll get around to everyone with the clock running down, but cyber falls into your bailiwick, James Paterson. You've been warning about this for a long time. 100 million mightn't buy us a lot.
Yeah. I was gonna say,
but where would you start?
Sadly, 100 million won't get you very far, but in the most recent federal budget, we invested $9.9 billion in effectively doubling the size of the Australian Signals Directorate, so that we've got both better defensive capability in the cyber realm, but also offensive cyber capability. And the great thing about cyber capability is it can be deployed much more quickly than a nuclear submarine can. As long as you can hire the people and train them and get them in place, then they're able to have an effect from day one. And it is also an asymmetric capability. When you're thinking about a larger adversary who might be able to do damage to us in the cyber realm, and they're certainly trying to do that right now as we speak, it's important that they know that we can reach out and touch them too, that we could have an impact on them. And the scenario that everyone is particularly worried about is an attempt to disable our critical infrastructure as a prelude to a global or regional crisis, which would destabilise us internally and prevent us from projecting our power into the region to protect our friends or our allies or our values. And that investment will help guard against that risk and also make sure it's a risk for others.
Pat Conroy, the government now has a cybersecurity minister. Sorry, Sharan, I'll just come to you just 1 minute if I could. What can we expect in the budget in terms of a commitment to cybersecurity? We saw the $9.9 billion that the previous government had outlined, but what can we expect?
Well, I'm also the Minister for Defence Industry, so your question is at the heart of one of my tasks. And that's why we've commissioned the Defence Strategic Review, because for the last 50 years, we've had lots of different theories of defence of Australia, forward defence, but our structure of our armed force has been relatively the same. 100 attack-fast fighter jets, 8 to 12 large Navy ships, 6 submarines, 3 brigades, about 60 tanks. So no matter what theory we had roughly the same force. So the Defence Strategic Review is all about what are our threats and what is the correct structure of the ADF, including cyber capability, to combat those threats.
And we can expect a similar commitment?
On cyber, well, that project is being funded right now, and we'll see in March the report coming in from Sir Angus Houston, a very esteemed former Chief of the Defence Force, and Stephen Smith, a former Defence Minister, that will make some strong recommendations about the structure of the ADF that will accompany our decisions around nuclear-propelled submarines.
Sharan, you wanted to say something?
Well, I want to shift the lens. I'm really worried that we are talking about preparing for war as an inevitability rather than looking at what the global architecture might be to prepare for peace. If you think about it, $100 million is a lot of money, I totally agree, but it could bring the world together. We meet every year, not hugely successfully, although I'm hoping that's going to change, particularly for Australia, around climate. And it is governments at the highest levels, it is civil society, it's the trade unions, it's the experts in academia. Why do we never bring the world together around the preventative measures for peace? We just released a global report called Our Shared Future with the oldest peace institution, the International Peace Bureau, the Olive Palmer Centre, which actually called for our common security at the height of the Cold War. And we've now joined forces to say we need to go beyond the talk, OK, let's prepare for the worst, but beyond the talk of war and as if it's a deterministic inevitability, and actually bring people together, use the dialogue and the commitment we can generate for peace and for democracy. And I'll finish, Dan, by saying with the democracy question, we've got less than 20% of the world's people, according to Freedom House, who live in genuine democracy, where human rights, labour rights, peace, democratic rights and freedoms exist. Let's bring the world together, do something about that.
Just to pick up on that.
We're almost out of time, so I'll have to say I'll behold Damien and Jennifer just to a minute each. But Damien and then...
Yeah, no, just really quickly, just to jump on that. I mean, I think one of the things that we see throughout the region and in a lot of democracies is, frankly, an overinvestment in militarization and an underinvestment in diplomacy. The State Department has so many vacancies in places all over the world because people left under the Trump administration and they haven't been hiring fast enough. And one of the things that I think is true in Australia too, in the Pacific, with all due respect, both your parties have done a terrible job for a very long time if you talk to people in the Pacific. And they say that Australia has been condescending to them for years. So what the world needs to do is get better at diplomacy and more creative with diplomacy. It's still a sclerotic system that doesn't work fast enough when you're competing with China that can get things done in 2 weeks.
Jennifer, final word.
Yeah, so I think, democracy, our institutions need to do better. If we want the rest of the world to come to democracy and, not see authoritarianism as a possibility, then our institutions, our governments need to create jobs, need to provide economic opportunities for the poorest. And I think that's where our systems will be the strongest.
Thank you so much. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Jennifer Sue, Pat Conroy, James Paterson, Damien Cave, and now you can clap, and in Brussels, Sharan Burrow. Once again, a great audience here. Thank you so much for your questions. Can I thank those as well for sharing your stories with us, and to you at home for joining in the conversation. We're coming to you live from Penrith in Western Sydney next week. Of course, a terrible time they've had there with floods and so on in recent months. But on the panel, best-selling author and journalist Johann Hari, Emergency Management and Agriculture Minister Murray Watt, Winnie Dunn from the Sweatshop Literacy Movement, and Archibald Prize-winning artist Black Douglas. Please head to our website and you can register to be in the audience. We'd love to see you, and you can join me on Monday for China Tonight, continuing the conversation we've been having here tonight. Until then, thanks again. Good night.